I think it's important for the early team to be pretty involved on the hiring side, and to be careful and sort of craft that team. I also think setting values early on and using that as part of the criteria for how they don't necessarily have to. It doesn't have to be a formal process, but being intentional about it is important. I think to then be able to select for those values. And if you don't do that, I think one of the things that can come through is sort of you end up with these accidental values, things that the company is sort of either intrinsic to the people at the company or the company's accidentally selecting for in its existing hires. And so I think that's something that's really worth being intentional about. And crafting that early team is unbelievably important.
Welcome to the Undefeated Underdogs podcast, where I unpack and narrate stories of ambitious people who turn obstacles into opportunities. My goal for this podcast is to create a platform to narrate underdog stories and maybe play a small, teeny tiny role in inspiring you. I intend to highlight the underdog mentality and make authentic conversations with people who play the long game, take action with a chip on their shoulder, and convert obstacles into opportunities. Buckle up, as I'll be bringing some authentic founders, VCs, community builders, and content creators who got underestimated their whole lives, and yet they beat all the odds to become insanely successful. Now, today I want to tell you a little bit about our awesome sponsor, Acquire.com. Selling a business is as tough as building a business. As someone who went through this process once, selling my own startup, I know the pain it takes to get to the end zone. This is where our sponsor shines. Imagine this. You're a founder who's built a solid SaaS product, acquired customers, and generating consistent monthly revenue. The problem is, you're not growing for whatever reason. Lack of focus, lack of skill, or just plain lack of interest, and you feel stuck. What should you do? The story I'd like to hear is, you buckled down, somehow reignited the fire, get past yourself and the cliches, and start working on your business rather than just in the business. You start building an audience, move out of your comfort zone to do sales and marketing, and in 6 months, you triple your revenue. The reality isn't as simple. Situations may be different from every founder facing these crossroads, but too many times, the story ends up being one of inaction and stagnation until the business becomes less valuable or worse, worthless. If you find yourself here or your story is likely headed down a similar road, I offer you a third option. Consider selling your business on Acquire.com. Capitalizing on the value of your time is a smart move. Acquire.com is free to list and they've helped hundreds of founders already. Go to try.acquire.com/Sharath and see for yourself if this is the right option for you. Now, let's get into today's episode. All right. So, folks who are listening, appreciate you for joining. So far, I've been invited, like so many leaders, product leaders, marketing leaders, founders, bootstrappers, VCs. I can go on, but I've never done this before where I invited a leader in engineering in something that it's very essential for any startup to focus on. It's one of the essential key pillars. And my next guest is a master at it. Like, she built, scaled engineering teams at scale. She worked at companies like Superhuman. Her first job is at Apple, which is amazing. I can go on and on about her, but without further ado, I would love to welcome Emuye Reynolds. Welcome to the show. How are you, Emuye? How is your day going?
My day is going very well. Thanks. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. Like I said, I think I've talked to many people on both sales, marketing, bootstrapping side, VC side, and kind of like never dived into this topic of, where should engineering start? It's generally founders tend to be the engineers. They develop the product, right? Or if I'm founders like me, outsource the product or use no code tools and like something, they'll make it happen. So I think the first question I have for you is, where do founders, in what phase do you think an engineering team should be established? Like at
Hmm.
what phase there's early stage startup to like fast growing pace and all whatnot. So in your opinion, in your experience, where should founders should take a decision about like building an engineering team?
hmm I think it varies a little bit depending on the nature of the product. I mean, I imagine the ideal scenario is that there is an engineering team, it grows and with the company. Um, I think there are situations where it makes sense to outsource it. It makes sense to have it not be embedded within the company, especially if even for a tech company, if the technical challenges aren't critical to the overall product, right? There are some tech companies where the go-to-market strategy or some aspect about the product is the pillar, and it's not. These are very hard technical challenges, or we need a world-class standout user experience. And in those situations, I think you can get away with building it a little bit later. Um, that hasn't, as an engineer, that hasn't been my experience. It's sort of in the boat you described, where I have, I'm a founder now. I've been on many, many
Mhm,
founding teams,
mhm,
and I actually have done something a little bit interesting, which is I've joined non-technical founders a couple
mm,
years in. I've been sort of the first 5 or 6 people in a company many, many times. I think I've done that like 5 times. Um,
mhm,
and those are companies that sometimes they've had there's technical debt, and we're transitioning to now that the company knows what they're building or is near product market fit. It's sort of like the let's build it for real phase. I think
mhm.
that's a time. I think that's a fine path for companies.
And I think you've, like I said, you've been like a founding employee at so many startups. So let's dive into that a little bit because I think that's very interesting for our listeners as well, who are like figuring out their first roles, whether it can be like a first job or I'm in that path right now. Should I join like very early or should I join an established startup? So what is something that you looked for when you joined in these early stage startups as founding member, and what is like the two things? One is, what is the reward that you got? you know I
Mhm.
kind of do know the answer for it.
Mhm.
At the same time, what is like the downside for it, like the upsides and the downside?
Yeah. So one of the things I look for that's maybe a little bit non-traditional is chemistry with the founders. You're going to spend so much time with those people, and um, I think the relationship between co-founders, there's a lot that's talked about how important that is. I think it's probably equally true with your founding team, or at least it's a very close second. So I want to make sure I gel with those people. I want to make sure there's room for me, and where I want to grow. Those are some of the things that I look for. Um, uh, what are the upsides and what are the downsides of being on a founding team? I mean, impact is, of course, one of the upsides. And for me, it's really important to wear many hats. I like when the
Mm,
job is different each day. And I like when I'm in the critical path for lots of different aspects of the company. And you get that you get that as founder, you get that being on a founding team. Um, the downsides, it's interesting because I think I'm the kind of, founding team member that treats it like my life. I'm as committed and dedicated to the thing I'm working on, I think, as anyone else in the company. Um, and it can be hard to be in that situation. And there is a difference between a founder and a founding team member. There is in some ways, it's like the commitment that the company has to you is a little bit different. There are co-founder breakups, but it's, I think, less common for an established company to have co-founder breakups than it is to have people in that founding team cycle through. So you want to make sure it's the right fit, and you're going to put everything into it. So you want to make sure the company is going to be somewhat loyal to you as well. That can be a downside, is that um, your position is a little bit more tumultuous than it might be if you were a founder.
mm,
Um, But I think for anyone in that early team, you have to be able to collaborate. You have to be able to. You're not going to make every decision regardless of what your position is, and so that feels very similar. I love it. I love being really early stage.
Mm,
You get to build, you get to wear different hats,
right.
and I think the other I guess downside I would say is that early stage companies are chaotic. They just are.
Right.
Yeah,
I think I think it's for people who embrace chaos and uncertainty. And so I've heard this. I was talking to a founder, and uh, kind of like similar topic I was discussing with him, and he said, I look for founders who want to join us founding, part of the founding team. It's like mostly they're like like probably like 1-2 steps away from becoming a founder, because
yeah.
it's literally like the founding team is everything, that they
Mhm.
do as founders, right? So that's probably like, an upside, which is you'll eventually kind of learn to be a founder in being part of the chaos.
Yeah, I probably have a different perspective on that than most people who are early to companies and who want to be founders. I that was being a founder was never important to me, honestly. And I've
Oh,
actually,
interesting.
yeah, it wasn't an anti-goal, but it just wasn't a goal of mine. Like there are so many interesting things to
Right.
work on. There's so many interesting people to work with. I have uh, you know, I've been fortunate enough to work on some really cool stuff. It was
Mhm.
never like, oh, this I didn't start this. So I
Right.
did become a founder more recently, but that was this is probably something like my seventh startup, where in all the ones previously I wasn't a founder.
Mm.
So I don't know. We had a lot of discussions like this at Superhuman in past companies where it's like, okay, we're going to bring someone in. We want to make sure they have that founder mentality.
Mm.
I think people can be motivated in many different ways. I've been all in, but I don't know that I would say that's because I aspired to be a founder. Um,
Mm.
I do think you're right that seeing an early stage company is some preparation for starting a company, of course, right? It's
Mhm.
like, I
Mhm.
mean, I'm a sports fan, so it's kind of like seeing the ball go through the basket, right? But
Yes.
I actually think seeing the large company, my experience at Apple, um, set me up for success in a similar way, right? Because that's
Mm.
truly like you're a part of a machine, a company that knows how to build successful products, that knows how to
Right.
get it right. So yeah, I would say working at a startup, to use our sports analogy, being on a founding team is like shooting the ball, and working
Mm.
at Apple or a big company is like seeing the ball go through the basket. And those two combined, I think, is a really good experience
Mm.
to start something.
Do you think uh, wannabe founders or operators, let's talk about operators, do you
Hmm.
think they should have those two lens, which is what you described, a lens where they actually shoot a lot of shots continuously, being an early stage, and the other lens is like probably like, probably someone like Steph Curry who's already hit so many shots and now he mastered at putting the ball through the basket, like, so do you think it's a requirement, or is it like what's your take on having those two lens, part of being an operator or even like wannabe founder?
I don't. I won't say it's a requirement. I think it is very helpful for that to be within that exists in a company, right? You want to have a kind of the DNA on both sides. Um, you know, I think it's a healthy balance. Like if you can, of course, an amazing candidate for a role at a startup is somebody who's been at a startup, many, many times before. If that person has also worked at a really established company that actually you sort of like knows what they're doing, I think that's a benefit. And certainly you want to make sure someone in the company has done that, right? I
Right.
think companies are probably going to be more successful at some point if you start to
Mm.
bring in sort of people who've experienced it before and seen and can pattern match with an established company.
I think pattern recognition is, I think, the key skill that you develop once you work for an established company, because everything is like kind of like signals. You pick a signal at an early stage. It's all about experiments without picking up signals. The signaling tracking comes later.
Hmm.
Uh, I really want to talk about Apple. Like,
Hmm.
of course, that's, I think that's your first job, if I'm not
Hmm.
wrong, and you worked at uh, So the first curious question I have is it really true that Apple at that size operates even as a startup? Like it's famously Steve Jobs said in one of the I think DXO keynotes or whatever it is. He says that Apple is like a bunch of mini startups working together on one mission, right? So is that true? At what length is it true? And what was your experience like working at Apple?
Yeah. Um, I think that is very much true. So it
Mm.
certainly operates like a bunch of companies. And the team I was on honestly still feels like the most startup-like experience I've ever experienced. Um,
Wow.
we, you know, there are both positives and negatives to that, but we were entering. So I worked on Apple TV, and we were entering a new market.
Hmm.
When I started, Apple TV didn't even exist. I remember when just to put context around like what era this was. When I joined Apple, their most popular product was the iPod, and it was a
Mm.
product I'd only touched like two iPods in my life when I started. Like, it just wasn't, it was a
Right.
very different world than the world now. Apple was a tech company, and I think it certainly transitioned at some point in that era to being sort of the tech company. Um,
Mm.
but yeah, so when I started, they described this product, Apple TV, and I was like, "What? Does it have a?" I didn't get it. I was like, "Does it have a DVD player?" It just was it was a completely different world. Um,
Right.
but entering that new market, we were in like perpetual crunch mode. Like I worked more there than I have in any startup I've ever worked at, and that, like I said, that was in some ways like the negative side of it, because
Mm.
it was
Exhausting.
extreme, I would say, for some of those
Mm.
years. Um, but Apple sort of operated in that era, and I think it can be different on different teams. There were very established teams at Apple that I'm sure were not operating like a startup, um, that were larger, all those kinds of things. My team was between 5 and 10 engineers for the 5.5 years that I was there. It was really small. Um,
Wow, that's it.
mhm. Yeah, and that's it. And at that time, I think again, this has changed somewhat. Like I left Apple in 2011, so it's been a while. But
Yeah.
at the time, Apple had very small teams, and even some of the more established teams were small. But it was especially true for the emerging teams. But one of the things that it's still fascinating to me about how Apple operated is it sort of felt like at every level of leadership, even individuals who are sort of leading themselves, it was like the company, every level was building for one person. It's like I was sort of building for me, and sort of my director was like sort of almost like a dictator of his own kind of world. It was this very bizarre structure, but it meant that you operated like you only needed to have like a very straight shot in terms of direction. We were like a very sharp pointed arrow,
Mm.
because sort of everyone was making decisions, almost as it seems weird, but almost as an individual as opposed to with a whole structure behind it. And in some ways, that's reminds me a lot of when you're at a startup, right? It's like you do what needs to be done, and you are an owner. Everyone is an owner at every level of leadership, even people who are, like I said, leading themselves. Um, yeah, I often say that my time at Apple was my most quintessential startup experience.
And it's so interesting what you said about uh, being very small.
Hmm.
Even it's such a big project, right? Apple TV is one of the key revenue streams right now. Of course, it's not like it took some time to like people to adapt to it, but it is fascinating to hear that 5 to 10 engineers over the 5 years of time you built such a big ecosystem together. So I think there is a lesson there, probably, like founders can, even I'm learning it, to make it small and concise, so you have, like you said, like unidirection, like going one direction rigorously, ridiculously, like focused.
Hmm.
uh what are the I have to ask about a couple of questions for sure.
Sure.
Now, I think around 2011, Steve was there, on and off. What was it like part of under his leadership? Like, what is something that, did he really impact it like to a level that, to you versus like, was he interacting with only key stakeholders? What was like, being his aura around Apple campus?
Yeah. So when I left in 2011, it was shortly after he passed away, actually. Um, so he was there for a lot of my time, and I actually worked in the building he worked at. They had this campus back then called Infinite Loop, which was
Yep,
like
yep.
these 6 buildings in a circle, and I worked in aisle one. And he worked in
Mm.
aisle one. He worked a floor above me, so you saw him around quite a bit, actually. Just in
Wow.
general, like anyone in that building would see him. He would be at lunch in the cafeteria, and we would always joke, it's like, please don't wait in this line, like go ahead of us. Right? Like I don't think your time is well served waiting behind me in this line. And he was kind of funny. He would always sort of walk around like looking. Once the iPhone came out, he would like just be looking at his phone, like walking around the campus, like literally like eyes glued to his phone. But yeah, so he was around. Apple TV was, I think he said at some point that it was sort of like a pet project or something like that. And I remember there was quite a bit of press around that, and even some of the team had sort of a negative sentiment, feeling like we're on this kind of pet project. I was kind of like, if you're on Steve Jobs' pet project, I'm okay with that, right? Like,
Yeah.
sounds like you're me. Um, so he had a lot of influence. There was some parts of the product that he sketched on like a napkin. Like we had this sort of like trailers. We had an app, actually, part of Apple TV back then, called it was like the Trailers app, and like the actual UI he sort of like drew on a napkin at some point. We had a little demo room where we was sort of like soundproofed. So just for context, also, flat screen TVs were like brand new. Like it was the era of like plasma TVs, and so it wasn't common for people to have a home setup, like home theater setups, like they are today. Um, so we had one that we could sort of experience Apple TV at Apple. Um, and he would sort of be in there at different times. I didn't interact with him a lot, but he was around. He would come to the floor. People would demo things for him. That kind of
Wow. It
thing.
looks like you're like inches away,
Hmm.
to to work with someone and to create like an impact. You're part of the legacy, right?
Hmm.
And that was fascinating. I think looking back, like you said, it's like what, 12, 15, 13 years now. Uh,
Yeah.
it is probably like one of your most, like you said, in your words, like, most proudest moment, I would say, is to basically go back. It's fine to like be on a pet project of Steve Jobs, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
What was it like? What was it like, looking back, if you were to like do a quick retrospect, is to create like, you have, I think Apple TV is one of my favorite products because it's so intuitive that I'm not going back to using any of the native, TV OSs, right? It's so intuitive, so I can operate it through my phone. So you have left your thumbprints, fingerprints on things that I use. I'm interacting with you for the first time. So the impact is so true.
Hmm.
What was it like? What was it like? What was the mindset after, even like before? Like what was it like working, on something that's truly like stayed forever?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't know at the time, right? And like you mentioned earlier, Apple TV sort of took some time to really land in the market. It was interesting because right when it came out, it had some of the highest user satisfaction of any product Apple had ever released. But
Hmm.
it didn't have the traction or the buzz around it, as I think Apple TV was announced in the same, like, whatever, I don't know if it was WWDC or I forget, whatever,
Right.
they used to have these kind of main press
Mhm.
releases. And I think it was announced, and the iPhone was like the one more thing in that announcement. And
Right.
so it sort of
Right.
was always overshadowed by the phone.
Yeah.
Um,
Mm.
so in it, we didn't know exactly what the business was going to look like.
Mm.
The first, a lot of people forget the first version of Apple TV was not, it's not like the little black puck-like device. It was actually gray, and it had a hard
Mm,
drive. It didn't stream, and it had component cable hookups. Like that's how you hooked it up to the TV. It was like basically like an iPod kind of UI. There
mm.
was, at the time the Apple TV first version came out, there was no movie or TV store. Like Apple didn't do movies, didn't do TV, so the
Right,
content
right,
had to come from, it was like your own ripped DVDs or like things. It just
right.
was a very different era. So now I can sort of say, and I saw some of this when I was there too. Um, I can look at it and be like, oh, it's really cool to have worked on this thing that impacted so many people. But I didn't know that that was going to be the case. I remember the first time I walked into an Apple store and saw an Apple TV, and like, people were using it. It was such a cool experience. You got the Apple TV, the Apple workers come over and they're like, hey, can I help you? And you're like, I got it. I know what I'm doing with this one.
I built it.
Yeah, yeah. Which is pretty fun though.
And is it true that uh, like at Apple, generally it's like they think, plan, strategize 5-10 years ahead of time? Is that true? Like, even for Apple TV, like, okay, we started somewhere, with the hard drive and everything, but do you saw the vision, like, or people around it building it, hey, this is just how we enter? But I think that's something that's fascinating about Apple, right? They just let other people enter to the market so fast, and they
Hmm.
observe, and they just
Hmm.
launch something ridiculously good. Even the Vision Pro is like, people are going
Hmm.
bonkers about it, right?
Right, right.
I'm at a terrible FOMO right now. Is, do you have to like get it
Yeah.
or no?
No,
So is that
I'm.
true? And to what extent is that like something that that's true? And what's something that you learn from it?
Yeah, I imagine there are some people in the company who are executing on a strategy. It didn't feel like that, and I'm honestly not sure. I think companies like Apple are in a position where they can take a lot of shots. They can try a lot of different things, right? Like Apple had a lot of products that weren't successful. Like I could, you remember the little like boom box, like that, the
Mm-hmm,
hi-fi,
mm-hmm. Yeah,
or
yeah.
the round the mouse that was like a puck.
Mm-hmm,
It was literally
mm-hmm.
just a circle, so you couldn't tell which way it was up. Um, for you don't know when you're working on it whether it's going to be, whether we didn't know if Apple TV was going to be the hi-fi or if it was going to be, I
Mm,
mean, I'd say the iPhone, but the iPhone hadn't even come out yet.
mm,
So you don't know when you're in that era. I imagine, like I said, there are some people, but I think it's more the position of the company that lets them try it and
right.
and move forward with it. Like Apple TV's been on it's been a decade of
Right.
iteration. The
Right.
product itself hasn't changed that much, but its
Mm,
position in the market, its position in our households has changed. I don't know
mm,
if someone knew that was going to happen. I think people thought there's a chance, but they can afford to get that wrong, and they do. I
love
think I remember I remember some of the things we used to sort of talk about back then. Google had, I think it was called Google TV, but it had this like this remote that had like a full keyboard on it, and it was just completely
it.
bizarre. This was the era of the Zune, right? Like Microsoft's like
Mm,
iPod. There are all these products these companies tried, and those
mm,
didn't necessarily stick. Apple got a few that stuck, but they got plenty that didn't stick.
mm. I think one after like listening to you, it reassures what Steve said so many times, is that we're a company where we build products for ourselves and our friends,
Hmm. Yeah.
and where we can share and be proud of saying that, hey, we built this, you might like it, right? Like, I
Hmm.
think that is like the core essence of what you said. Absolutely, it's like
Hmm.
try different things, and I think the product is not the point, the positioning is to the product in the market is like the point, right?
Hmm.
uh I love it so much. Appreciate you for sharing, like, some of the inside stories.
Yeah. Yeah.
And let's talk about like Superhuman. You again, early 2014 is when it got founded. You were I think around 2016.
Hmm.
So why Superhuman? Why did you enter, like, such a early, after like working at Apple? What was
Hmm.
it? You did a bunch of things in between as well, but I'm just curious about understanding why did you kind of didn't go back to build your own thing, which is what you're doing now. Instead
Hmm.
of you were a technical architect, you were again like a software engineer,
Hmm.
uh, you were the head of technology, and like you did so many other things. So I'm just curious about the big corporation to going into like a startup. Like, is that like because of the burnout, the number of hours you put in?
I left Apple because I looked around, and Apple was one of those places where a lot of people had spent their entire career there, and or had returned many times. And I was sort of looking around. The pace I was learning um, had declined. Like I wasn't learning at the same rate that I once was. And I was like, if I want to leave now, because I think you can get to a point where it's very difficult to leave a company if it's all you know.
Mm,
So that's kind of what made me start looking around. I didn't know anything about startups. I mean, it sounds funny to say this now, but like I didn't even know what a startup was, or like I just had no exposure to it. Um, when I actually it's when I was an intern when I was in college, like the summer after my sophomore year, I interned at Microsoft and I worked on the Word team. And
mm.
I thought I wanted to find the opposite experience, which is sort of what led me to Apple. In my mind, the opposite of Microsoft was Apple, right? Like, I mean, of course, they obviously have a lot more in common than many other companies.
Right.
So yeah, I sort of entered that startup world and I just got hooked. And a lot of the reason I got hooked was my first team.
Mm,
We just had great chemistry. Still to this day, a lot of the people I work with are my close friends. It was a
mm,
really great ride. So I kind of got
mm,
lucky with these two very different early experiences. Then I
mhm,
bounced around a little bit because I'd never learned how to vet. I didn't know how to vet a company because I went
mhm,
to Apple and then I went to another startup. I went to a startup for several years, which was great.
mhm,
Um, so I was bouncing around a little bit, trying to find a place to land and figure out what I wanted to do. And I was kind of at the tail end of that exploration process when
mhm,
I heard about Superhuman and met with the founding team. I think when I joined, the company was like 7 or 8 people or something like that. So it was very small.
mm.
Um, and I liked a lot. I liked that the vision was huge. Like it was just an absolutely massive vision. I was at
Right.
a point in my career where I knew I wanted to be a driver. I didn't want to be a passenger on that ride, and I thought
Mm,
that there was like really good role alignment. I just really gelled with the team, and I actually when I joined, I was the head of I think it was the head of mobile initially, and eventually
mm.
became the head of engineering. Yeah, there's a lot of space for me at the company. I know if you'd been like a year earlier, hey, do you want to work on email? I'd been like, what? Email? Because I'd
Right.
only done
Right.
consumerish kinds of things, and that's kind of where my heart was. But I liked that they were taking a consumer approach to
Mm.
email. I used to always say it was kind of like if if Apple built mail, this is what you would expect. I mean,
Mhm.
of course, Apple does have mail, but this
Right.
is kind of
Right.
what you'd expect. So yeah,
Right.
that kind of led me to Superhuman.
And uh, yeah, like I said, it's like it's a movement. I would say Superhuman literally like showed uh, how a startup should grow.
Hmm.
With their, I think I don't know if they patented it, but I think they should done it. Like the waitlist
Hmm.
concept is ridiculously phenomenal, right? Like you only invite few people, like you share and you get more access, you get like the number changes your role. So that is so like gamified the whole system.
Yeah.
uh you being part of the team in those early days, what was it like to kind of like again changing different hats, right? I'm sure that you wouldn't just like do 9 to 5, you would have done many things.
Hmm.
What are some external things that you did that actually helped you become who you are right now as as an engineering product person? I want to also talk about the product side,
Yeah.
but let's kind of like
Sure.
unpack the engineering side.
Yeah. Yeah, Superhuman. It's you talked about sort of the pride that I'm sure you're picking up on from my Apple days. I definitely am proud of that experience, and it's really cool to have worked on something that's been impactful. And I said that I feel very fortunate to have been in some of these roles because I think Superhuman also had a lot of impact on how startups execute. There's a lot of things
Hmm.
that we did. I see product launches. I see of course the wait list. The way that companies approach finding product market fit, some of these different techniques that we that we executed there, I see those having shifted the landscape of startups, which I think is very cool. Yeah, I did get to wear a lot of hats. I think one of the things that's been helpful for me, kind of since post Superhuman, has been I was involved in hiring a lot of the early company. So
Mm,
whether it was creating hiring plans, whether it was actually sourcing candidates, interviewing, I think I interviewed probably the if you look at the next 50 people after me, I think I interviewed almost every person, if not everyone. Um, and was like a major part of bringing them on the team, and that in every role, which I think has been really interesting now that I've transitioned to being a founder,
mm,
because a lot of building the team is, of course, there's a lot of engineering, but there's a lot of other roles, and it helped me going off and researching what skills do we think would be successful for this particular role? What are we looking for? What do we need this person to do when we had something we needed in the company? Um, Actually showed me quite a lot about how companies function and like the different roles and the types of people that you need to bring in. So I think that's
mm,
been really helpful. And then on the engineering side, lots of learnings. One of the things that I think carried over from my Apple days was our team was really small. We probably were too small for too long. But I think small teams can accomplish quite a lot, and you don't have the overhead of uh, you don't have the overhead in terms of communication costs and a lot of the things, the management costs that you have for bigger teams. You have it, but to a lesser extent. So that
mm,
was one of sort of the lessons that kind of carried through and I think was helpful for that early. We had a very senior, very small team with a
mm.
pretty large surface area. Email is actually a really hard technical problem. So yeah,
Of course, yeah. So I'm fortunate as well to kind of experience that side when I was at Product Hunt, which is
Mhm,
so lean for such a big platform.
mhm,
Uh, I kind of experienced why certain founders think lean teams are really the right way to right path to put success for, right?
mhm,
I think there is a level of trust and there is a level of focus that lean teams bring into, and there is less distraction. If you think about it, it's more about we need this, let's get it done, right?
mhm,
That jobs to be done mindset is really, really, I think, something I if I were to build a startup, for sure it's definitely going to be lean, regardless of the stage, money, and all that.
mhm,
So you've briefly touched about hiring.
mhm,
I wanna understand what are the things that founders should learn, especially early stage. uh, they don't have recruitment teams, or they don't have you know bigger teams be involved. What are the things that they should learn from your experience that you want to like pass it on?
mhm. Yeah, I think interviewing and hiring, we talk a lot about hiring in startups, but I think we don't talk very much about interviewing and how
Mm,
important that actually is to company building. It's a skill that I think, I think, founders, of course, there's a lot they have to do. There's a lot they have to do well. You can't be great at everything, can't necessarily be good at everything, but that's one I think that surprisingly, there's not a lot of emphasis on. Like, how do you
mm,
figure out what skills you need? How do you create a process to select those skills and evaluate those skills in candidates? And then how do you iterate that process as you have kind of people moving through the company? So I think that's a skill we should actually flex a bit more than we do um, in startups. And I think there's a lot of there are materials out there in terms of how do you get better at interviewing. It's just there isn't an emphasis on it. There's a lot of talk about hiring, but how do you hire if you don't interview, right? So that's definitely something I think quite a lot about. Um, I think it's important for the early team to be pretty involved on the hiring side, um, and to be careful and sort of craft that team. Um, I also think setting values early on and using that as part of the criteria for how they don't necessarily have to, it doesn't have to be a formal process, but being intentional about it is important, I think, to then be able to select for those values. And if you don't do that, I think one of the things that can come through is um, sort of you end up with these accidental values, things that the company is sort of um, either intrinsic to the people at the company or the company's accidentally selecting for in its existing um, hires. And so I think that's something that's really worth being intentional about. And crafting that early team is unbelievably important. Uh, yeah, it's tough though. I mean, you've got to sort of lean on network, and if you don't have network, I think you have to sort of find recruiters or other ways of sourcing. I spend a lot of
Mm.
my career sourcing or looking at resumes and that kind of thing to build these early teams.
Mm. And do you have a particular hiring strategy that worked for you that you want to share? Like, let's get into like tactical stuff, right?
Mhm.
Where do you start? Uh, what is like the process like 0 to 1, and how do you close it? Like, is there a proper? I would love to know about the interview tips as well. Like, what
Mhm.
exactly, like, what kind of questions do you ask to kind of understand other people, the candidates? So, do you want to share
Mhm.
something that you did at even like you want to understand about how to establish like an engineering team from that
Mhm.
hiring strategy, as well as generally like founders, what can I learn from that process?
Yeah, I think one of the components on the tactical side that's important is research, right? Like anything that you want to hire for, any skill that you need, someone has done that before, right? So actually going and looking at interview plans, reading them, trying to make sure you have like a full process before you start hiring and a process that you're going to iterate, I think is very important. There's lots of good resources out there, and it's not even important that you pick the best one. It's sort of getting that overview and picking and choosing different elements from different processes to create your own and craft your own, I think is quite important. Um, I think the other thing is really thinking about what's important to the particular needs of the company. So I mentioned at Superhuman we had a pretty senior team. I think that was critical because there are lots of very hard technical challenges that let us be lean, that let us kind of operate with a smaller team, and then we needed to at some point we wanted to transition that because I think having like diversity in a lot of different ways is incredibly important to the team as well, including the sort of energy that you get with and many times that you get with youth, right? Or people who are at least earlier in their journey. So being able to create a support layer was something that we wanted to establish before we then brought on um, really scaled in terms of people who were earlier in their journey. And again, I think it's less important exactly what approach you take, and more important that it's an intentional approach, and you're thinking through, okay, here's what I need. I've done this research to see how other people select for these skills. I'm now trying a process. We've made this hire. It worked or it didn't work, and I've created a loop to integrate that into any output back into the process.
Interesting. In any interview, like specific tips that you want to share, like what kind of questions that people generally miss when they actually want to interview people, or any things that you want to mention about? Hey, these things are so obvious, but they just miss it for whatever
Hmm.
reason.
What do people miss when they're interviewing? Um, I think one of the things people miss is so interviews are, it's an hour, it's a couple hours. It is both. First of all, it's a two-way interview. I think a lot of the times we treat it like the only person interviewing is the candidate, but in reality, they should also be evaluating the company.
Mm,
So that's something I look for too. If the person doesn't have any
mm,
questions, if they're not really trying to understand, it's not that they won't be successful, but it's completely random whether or not they are successful then,
right.
right? And so I want to make sure and push whoever I'm interviewing to make sure that they are treating it like a two-way interview. That's just
Mm,
going to help with kind of get to the best fit.
mm,
But the other thing I would say is you've got this, a couple hours that you need to put your best foot forward. If you aren't putting your best foot forward in those couple hours, I don't optimize for false negatives. I don't optimize for saying no when I should have said yes. Like I'm
mm,
okay with that. I'm okay with this didn't work. For whatever reason, um, you know, whether it's we've set forth our criteria and the person, didn't meet it in certain ways, or it didn't go well. All of those things. I'm okay just putting that time into
mm,
a different candidate.
Interesting. I like that. I think uh, they have to put skin in the game, is what you're saying. In a way,
Hmm. Hmm.
it's not like one way where you hear these questions and you answer. It's like kind of like a conversation. I like that a lot. Uh, so, what advice would you give for someone who's kind of transitioning from big corporations to startups? Like,
Hmm.
what are the things that they look for? They probably, like, in your case, you moved from kind of Apple to Superhuman, right?
Hmm.
Through many
Right.
years, but
Hmm.
what do you what advice would you give?
I'm not sure this is advice, but at least one of the things that really shocked me. So at Apple, we didn't use any existing software. Like I had, this is the era of Stack Overflow, but I didn't even really know what that was because you have access to the other people who've built the software you're depending on. You can call
Mm,
them. So I was like absolutely shocked to be when I left the company. I was sort of like everything was black box about all the tools I was using. And instead of calling
mm,
the person who wrote the software, I had to like go look up like how do you do that? How do you I look on Stack Overflow
mm,
and find people who didn't actually know the inner workings that were trying to answer these questions. That was something that was actually one of the more interesting transitions that I needed to make. But in terms of what advice I would say, I sort of stumbled through a lot of things, and I think I ended up finding my way. But um, take some time to explore and
mm,
find things you are interested in using and actually touching and working with, and then talk to those companies. And when you're
mm,
with a big company, there's often this like very established uh, point of connection if you want to get a job. I'm a huge fan of I find a product I like and then I just email the people who work on it and I'm like, hey, I want to work on this, and then kind of go from there and see.
mm,
So I think there's no closed door. I would say also when it's the startup world, it may not lead to a job, but it might.
yeah, you should shoot your shot, right?
Yeah.
um, Now that you're I think you're not part of Superhuman, for I think last 2 years, 3 years.
Mhm.
I'm excited to learn what you're working on next. What's next for Emuye? What's going on in your life?
Yeah. So I started a company. It's always hard to say when because it's kind of tinkering around with some things, and that sort of turned into a company. But we're super small. The origin story is really um, I was exploring what I wanted to do next, talking with a lot of different companies, and I was mostly looking for VP Eng or head of product kinds of roles. And almost every company I talked to had the same set of problems. The reason they were hiring for that role is
Mm,
because they were having trouble prioritizing, aligning on the priorities, and communicating around the
mm,
priorities on their product teams. And so, yeah, well, we're working on we're calling it Udo, and we're trying to solve that problem. And we want to make it easier for product teams to make better data driven decisions faster.
mm.
Yeah, so it's early days, and we're kind of cranking away building, but it's been a lot of fun.
Excited. We haven't touched your product side of expertise. So I think every builder has some side of product knowledge or product intuition, right? Whether even like take Steve Jobs, he's a builder. It,
Hmm.
it doesn't matter if he write the code or not. He knows how a product works, right? So in
Hmm.
your case, you actually build things. Like you're a
Hmm.
developer, you're like a technical person. So how much of your experience helped you develop that skill as a product person or a product leader?
Yeah, it's actually something I was interested in even before. I think I'm a builder because I love products, right? That
Yeah.
happens to be sort of my tool, my hammer to actually get things I'm interested in into the world. But it's
Hmm.
actually the user experience, like how people interact with technology. That's the thing I was interested in before I ever even kind of went down the CS and eventually engineering path. Um,
Mm,
and that got cultivated, I think, at Apple where there weren't any product managers. So that engineering team, like I mentioned, we're 5 to 10 people. We had one designer, and then their product decisions were sort of made at every level of leadership. There was no real process, and that meant there was a lot of filling in the gaps on the engineering team.
mm,
And since it was something I was already super interested in, I spent a lot of time thinking about how people were going to interact with the product. Um,
mm.
then after that, I sort of continued to foster that sort of level of thinking at different jobs. I think you can be one or the other, and I think you can be both. I think you're right that most of the time, the builders we think about, some part of why they're building or what's interesting to them is actually the end goal as opposed to the tools and technologies themselves. But
Right.
I've seen great engineers who, they're in it for the technology. They the sort of the process of building the thing is more important than the end goal. Um,
Mm.
yeah, that happens to not be the case for me though.
Yeah. Um, I know we're on time, so would love to close it off on one question, which is how do the phases of a startup from early stage to subsequent growth stages impact decision making in leadership roles? Like in this case, you had like engineering role leadership. So what is kind of that? Do that is that like really a thing where as you grow you make decisions in a different way versus early stage?
I think you absolutely should. Um, I think the lesson I've learned here is we get so attached to these things, like they become our babies, like they become the thing we're
Mm,
very passionate about. And I think it's important to really think about, um, is it when that starts to get in the way, right? So I think one of the things we should fold into our decision making as the company scales, as the company grows, it has different needs. We talked
mm,
about pattern recognition. There's going to be a lot of things, a lot of patterns that we can't recognize because we're individuals. So making sure to surround yourself with people who have seen that stage, have done that thing, and whether it's as an advisor, as an employee to the company, but being okay. We go from you make every decision at a really early stage company, and at some point that actually gets in the way of the company.
mm,
And making sure that you're not trying to make those decisions because it's your baby, but
mm.
because and making sure you have the right set of people, the most
Right,
knowledgeable set of people around it. I think that's a
right.
really important lesson that I've sort of learned throughout my career.
I love that. Emuye, thank you so much. This has been so knowledgeable. I think I've learned a lot about hiring and setting up interviews, that whole process. And I really, really appreciate you for sharing some of the experiences or memories from Apple, which are always good to hear. Such a amazing company making a lot of impact on our lives. Any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Well, I just wanted to say I appreciate you having me on. It's been a great chat. It's been fun reminiscing about some of these past experiences. Yeah. So thank you so much.
Awesome. That yeah, hopefully like listeners, you learn one or two things, and we do this for that, like basically like enhance your either like put a plant in your in your mind about whatever it is. In this case, how to hire scale engineering teams in the right way. Emuye, thank you so much. Appreciate you. And that's a wrap, folks. See you all in the next episode.
Thank
Cheers.
you.